In 1979, the iconic performer who had already cemented her place in pop culture history embarked on a routine legal process that would end up unearthing a deeply personal and startling truth about her own identity. She had decided to legally change her name to match the mononym the world knew her by, a name that had become synonymous with fame, fashion, and fierce individuality. What she didn't expect, however, was that this official procedure would lead her to a discovery that would shake the foundation of what she had always believed about herself. The name she thought she was given at birth wasn't the one recorded on her birth certificate. She had spent her entire life believing that her birth name was one she carried with a sense of elegance and uniqueness. It wasn't just a label. It was a part of her personal narrative, an origin story that set the tone for a life of glamour and self-made reinvention. To find out otherwise, during something as mundane as filling out legal paperwork, turned out to be more than just a clerical surprise. It was disorienting, deeply emotional, and strangely existential. This wasn't a typo on a form or a misspoken nickname. It was the official, state-sanctioned documentation of her very identity, and it contradicted everything she thought she knew about her beginnings. The revelation hit her in a way that was both shocking and oddly surreal. There she was, already a global superstar, already a household name, yet suddenly she was faced with a version of herself that was unfamiliar. The name she had embraced for decades, first as a child, then as a rising performer, and eventually, as an internationally celebrated icon, was apparently never legally hers to begin with. Instead, a completely different, more common name had been quietly sitting in the background the entire time, stamped on a government-issued document and hidden under layers of stage lights, magazine covers, and chart-topping albums. What made the experience even more jarring was the context in which it unfolded. The late 1970s were a transformative time in her personal and professional life. Having navigated intense public scrutiny, multiple reinventions, and a series of high-profile relationships, she was finally at a place where she could consolidate her identity, simplify it, own it, and put it on record. The decision to formally claim her stage name was not just administrative, it was symbolic. It represented control, autonomy, and the power to define oneself, even after years of being defined by tabloids and public perception. That this moment of self-assertion would instead become one of confusion made it all the more impactful. She reportedly reacted to the discovery with a mix of disbelief and amusement. It wasn't just a case of mistaken paperwork, it was as if the ground had shifted slightly beneath her. There's something profoundly intimate about a name. It carries with it family heritage, parental intent, and a sense of continuity. To find out after a lifetime of hearing and identifying with a specific name that this wasn't the one officially bestowed upon her at birth created a strange and unexpected emotional ripple. For most people, a name is something taken for granted, an unquestioned aspect of identity that stays consistent through time. But for her, this bureaucratic detour threw that certainty into question. Even more intriguing was how this discovery highlighted the tension between public identity and private truth. Her entire career had been built around a carefully constructed persona. The world knew her as a singular force, a name, a voice, a style that stood apart. And yet, in the cold, impersonal ink of a birth certificate, she was someone else. That contrast underscored the sometimes fraught relationship between who we are perceived to be and who we actually are, especially when public image becomes a kind of mythology. Her case illustrated how fame can sometimes obscure the simpler facts of one's origin. Ultimately, the revelation didn't alter the trajectory of her career, nor did it change the affection and reverence her fans held for her. But personally, it added a curious and somewhat ironic layer to her life story. The idea that even a global icon can be caught off guard by a fundamental detail of her own identity was both humanizing and oddly poetic. In a world where she had been in control of so many aspects of her narrative, this one slipped past her unnoticed, until a moment of bureaucratic clarity revealed the hidden truth. The circumstances surrounding the naming of the legendary entertainer were as unconventional as much of her life would later become. It was 1946, and her mother, Georgia, was a teenager, just 19 years old, when she gave birth in a modest hospital setting. It was a different era, one without the elaborate birthing plans or support systems that many expect today. The labor had been long, exhausting, and unmedicated. After hours of intense physical and emotional strain, Georgia found herself overwhelmed and depleted. In the haze that followed childbirth, she was approached by a nurse asking a simple but pressing question: what would the baby's name be? In that moment, Georgia didn't have a carefully considered list or a firm decision. She hadn't mapped out the perfect name in advance, and certainly hadn't imagined needing to finalize something so quickly after such an ordeal. Pressed for an answer while still in pain and foggy from the experience, she did what many young, overwhelmed mothers might have done. She improvised. She pulled inspiration from the people and influences around her. One of those inspirations was the daughter of a well-known actress at the time, Lana Turner, whose child was named Cheryl. Another influence was closer to home, her own mother, Linda. Out of these two figures, she attempted to craft something distinct, elegant, and original: Cherylin. To her, this improvised blend of names was meaningful. It wasn't just a creative combination. It was a tribute, partly to celebrity glamour, partly to familial connection. It was also reflective of the kind of originality and flair that her daughter would later embody so fully. Georgia believed she had given her child a name that stood apart, a name with softness and strength, something that sounded like it belonged to someone destined for the spotlight. However, what actually ended up on the official documentation did not reflect that intention. For reasons that remain unclear, whether due to miscommunication, hospital error, or a nurse's assumption, the name recorded on the birth certificate was not Cherylin, but rather Cheryl. That single word, a more conventional and common name, became the official record of identity for a child whose life would be anything but conventional. The shift from Cherylin to Cheryl may seem minor to an outsider, but for those who place deep significance on names and their meanings, it was a jarring oversight. What adds to the irony of the situation is how much a name can carry: dreams, expectations, and sometimes even a blueprint for how one sees oneself. Georgia had crafted a name in a moment of personal vulnerability, yet it held creative intentionality. That it was instantly reduced to a name she hadn't chosen introduced a quiet kind of erasure. There was no grand family dispute or dramatic correction, just a quiet mistake that followed her daughter through the years without notice. This incident speaks volumes about the fragility of identity when it intersects with bureaucracy. A tired teenage mother, a busy hospital staff, and a rushed birth certificate created a rift between intention and reality that would go unnoticed for decades. It wasn't until years later, when her daughter had become a world-renowned performer and decided to legally simplify her name, that the discrepancy came to light. Until that point, everyone, including the entertainer herself, assumed the name given to her was the one she had always known. There's a certain poignancy in the image of a young mother, still dazed from childbirth, trying to give her daughter a unique beginning in the only way she could. Despite her youth and exhaustion, Georgia was still thinking creatively, still trying to shape her daughter's identity in a way that honored both family and the world beyond it. Yet, the outcome of that moment, a name that didn't match the vision, mirrors the unpredictable twists life often delivers. This misnaming is more than a clerical anecdote. It's a snapshot of how something as profound as a name can be altered by chance. And for someone whose later identity would be constructed so purposefully, so visibly, and so unapologetically, it remains a curious reminder that even the most iconic lives can begin with an accidental twist. The difference of a few letters marked the gap between what was imagined and what was documented, a small administrative mishap that echoed through a lifetime of personal. When the surprising revelation about her name came to light, the entertainer was understandably taken aback. After spending her life under the assumption that she had been named Cherylin, finding out that her legal name was something else entirely caused a ripple of disbelief. She had built an identity around that name. It had been a cornerstone of how she introduced herself to the world, the label under which she grew into her own creativity and fame. So when this information came to light during a legal name change process, it wasn't just a bureaucratic surprise, it was a deeply personal discovery. Seeking clarity, she turned to the one person who could possibly explain the mix-up. Her mother, Georgia. Surely there had to be a story, a rationale, a lost piece of family lore that could explain why the name she believed was hers never actually made it onto her birth certificate. She approached Georgia, expecting perhaps an emotional explanation, maybe even an apology or an acknowledgement of confusion. What she got instead was something entirely different. A shrug. Her mother's reaction was marked by a surprising nonchalance. With a calmness that bordered on indifference, Georgia simply said, "I was only a teenager, and I was in a lot of pain. Give me a break." That was it. No long-winded tale, no regretful reflection, just a blunt reminder of how young and overwhelmed she had been at the time of her daughter's birth. It was an answer that could only come from someone who had long since made peace with the imperfections of the past. This kind of response could have stung. After all, names are not just labels, they're tied to identity, memory, self-perception. But instead of escalating the moment, it diffused it. The comment wasn't dismissive so much as it was honest. Georgia had lived through something challenging and had done what she could under the circumstances. Her exhaustion, pain, and youth were not excuses, but explanations. The shrug and the "give me a break" weren't signs of carelessness. They were simply emblematic of someone who had survived a difficult situation without the luxury of perfection. There's a strange kind of comfort in that response. It reminded her that not everything in life is meticulously planned, that sometimes the details that seem so monumental in retrospect were, at the time, just fleeting moments under pressure. Georgia hadn't set out to obscure her daughter's identity. She had simply named her as best she could while recovering from an unmedicated labor at a young age. That moment had never been revisited or corrected, not out of malice, but out of sheer practicality and the inertia of moving forward. What also becomes clear is the generational contrast in how identity and self-perception are managed. For the daughter, who had spent a lifetime refining her image and asserting her individuality, the name carried enormous symbolic weight. For the mother, who had lived through hardships and raised a child on limited resources, the name was just one of many details in a chaotic life. Where one saw a defining feature, the other saw a footnote. That gap in perspective added an almost comedic touch to the situation, as if to say, we make a big deal out of the things we can afford to care about. This interaction, brief and unadorned as it was, managed to capture the essence of their relationship. It was straightforward, unfiltered, and deeply rooted in reality. There was no drama, no defensiveness, just a mother explaining in her own plain-spoken way that she had done her best under the circumstances. It humanized both of them, the daughter for her curiosity and search for understanding, the mother for her blunt honesty and emotional resilience. It also added a layer of humility to the entertainer's story. For someone whose life had been marked by grandeur, glamour, and meticulous control over her public image, this tiny, unexpected inconsistency from the past served as a humbling footnote. It was a reminder that everyone, no matter how famous or polished, comes from a place shaped by imperfect people doing their best in imperfect situations. What could have been a moment of disappointment or even confrontation instead became a simple exchange, a mother offering a slice of truth and a daughter accepting it for what it was. The shrug became more than a gesture. It became a symbol of moving on, of not letting the past weigh too heavily, and of understanding that sometimes the answers we get are not profound or poetic, they're just real. In 1979, the woman the world had come to recognize by a single name made the decision to solidify that identity through legal means. She had already achieved monumental fame by then, and her name, short, bold, unforgettable, was known across continents. It appeared in magazine headlines, on record covers, in film credits, and in bright lights on stages around the globe. The name had become not only her signature, but also a brand, a symbol of transformation, resilience, and reinvention. Despite all that recognition, however, she had never taken the formal step of making that singular name her legal identity until that year. The decision wasn't made on a whim. For someone whose life and career had unfolded in the public eye, whose every move had been dissected and scrutinized, the desire for simplicity and autonomy held powerful appeal. She had gone through various phases in her personal and professional life, each one marked by different surnames she had adopted through marriages and personal transitions. But as the 1970s drew to a close, she felt the need to return to her core, to claim, with complete finality, the name she had carried into global stardom. This process required stripping away all the additional names she had acquired over time. It meant saying goodbye not just to former surnames linked to partners or past legal identities, but also to the inherited ones from her childhood. Each of those names carried history, meaning, and emotional weight. They reflected connections to family, love, and growth, but they also represented chapters she was ready to close. In choosing to keep only her single, iconic first name, she was making a powerful statement about who she was and who she had become, not defined by anyone else, not tethered to history she didn't choose, but standing fully in her own truth. What made the act even more significant was the contrast it presented with her earlier discovery that the name she thought she was given at birth, Cherlyn, was not what appeared on her birth certificate. That surprise, unexpected and mildly unsettling, could have complicated her understanding of her personal narrative. Yet rather than dwell on it or allow it to alter her sense of self, she used it as further motivation to affirm her identity, on her own terms. The name she chose wasn't about correcting a bureaucratic mistake, it was about declaring autonomy. By officially adopting the mononym, she joined a rare and elite group of figures in modern history known by just one name, individuals. So singular in presence and impact that a last name became irrelevant. It wasn't about arrogance, it was about precision. Her name had become a cultural symbol, representing not just her music and performances, but also her bold fashion choices, outspoken personality, and ever-evolving public image. She wasn't just changing her name, she was codifying a legacy. There's something profoundly liberating in that decision. For most people, names are given by parents, by tradition, by societal expectation. But she took control of hers, reshaping it in a way that mirrored her artistic journey. Every note she sang, every role she played, every statement she made under that name helped reshape what it meant. In choosing to legally adopt it, she brought her personal and public identities into full alignment. This wasn't just an act of paperwork. It was a declaration of selfhood. She wasn't becoming someone new. She was affirming who she had been all along. All the names that had come and gone before had played their roles in shaping her path, but now they could be set aside. The name that remained was the one that had carried her through reinvention after reinvention, through hardship, triumph, and the many layers of a legendary career. Even decades later, that choice continues to resonate. It serves as a reminder of how names can be powerful tools for self-definition. They're not just labels, they're stories, choices, declarations. In this case, the choice to reduce everything to one clear, unapologetic word was more than symbolic. It was the final brushstroke on a portrait she'd been painting for years. A portrait of someone who refused to be confined by expectations or defined by anyone else's narrative. The name she claimed was hers alone, and with it, she stepped even more fully into the spotlight she had always commanded. The story behind her name, from its unexpected origins to its final legal affirmation, offers more than just a curious anecdote. It reveals the deeper complexities of identity, legacy, and self-determination. In a world where names are often given at birth and accepted without question, her journey stands out as a testament to personal agency. She did not passively accept the circumstances of her naming. Instead, she chose to take ownership of her identity in a way that was both deliberate and deeply symbolic. The name she ultimately claimed wasn't just a label, it was a statement about who she was, what she had endured, and what she refused to be defined by. At the heart of it all is a sense of control. She didn't allow history, clerical mistakes, or the names of others to shape her sense of self. Each step, from discovering the error on her birth certificate to confronting her mother with curiosity rather than anger, to legally adopting the name the world already knew her by, demonstrates a calm, assured confidence in her identity. Her story reminds us that our past may inform who we are, but it doesn't have to dictate who we become. With intention, clarity, and courage, we can shape our identities in ways that reflect our true selves, not just our inherited circumstances. What makes her story particularly resonant is the contrast between the mundane setting in which it began, a tired teenage mother giving birth in a hospital, and the larger-than-life legacy it led to. Out of an improvised name, a mistaken record, and a shrugging explanation emerged one of the most iconic figures in entertainment. It's a striking reminder that greatness often comes from humble, imperfect beginnings. The disconnect between what was intended and what was recorded never held her back. Instead, it became another layer of her rich, multifaceted journey. Her choice to legally define herself by a single name was not about shedding the past, but about consolidating it, bringing together decades of personal evolution under one clear identity. And that name, short and powerful, now holds everything she has been: performer, trailblazer, survivor, icon. It's a name that has filled stadiums, topped charts, broken records, and defied convention. And yet, behind that name is still the woman born to a young mother in a hospital room, the woman who learned decades later that her sense of self was even more self-created than she realized. In a culture that often clings to labels, her journey is a bold declaration that identity is not fixed. It can evolve, it can be reclaimed, and most importantly, it can be chosen. Through this seemingly small but deeply meaningful journey, she reaffirmed what fans had always known. She was, and always would be,